Hello, everybody. I'm Ed Parcaut, host of Helping the Brave, and it's bringing our guest today, Julian Chapman. How you doing, Julian?
Great, Ed. It's great to be here.
I appreciate you being here. I don't get, I mean, I get a lot of UK people, but I don't necessarily get a lot of Canada people about being on the service. So thanks for coming in and talking to us about that. How long were you? What service were you in Canada?
So I served. I served in the army. I was an infantryman. Started off as a private soldier, and worked my way up, I suppose is the best way to describe it. And I served for 34 years. Now, most of my career was what we refer to as the primary reserve. So we have a different form of reserve service here, where you can virtually have a complete career in the reserves and then do call outs, as we call it, for longer periods, for deployments, that sort of thing. So those 34 years, as I like to say, and being very Canadian, I had a foot in the canoe and a foot on the shore. So in other words, I had a civilian career, a civilian life, and a military life simultaneously.
Well, during those 34 years, did you get deployed?
I was in Haiti in the early days, but I ended up in roles that were primarily political of nature, shall we say. So I spent a bit of time in Eastern Europe, that sort of thing. The Baltic states and working with our allies, working with American forces down in the U.S., working in Germany, working in the U.K. So those sort of pieces as came up.
So let's back. So reserves in the United States is basically you do 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. Is that basically pretty much what you did up there?
Yeah, it's more or less the same thing. It's so it's expandable and contractible from that standpoint. And I retired as the deputy commander of the 4th Canadian Division. So our divisions up here, our Army divisions, have a full-time, a regular commander and a reserve deputy commander. So that was my role, my load station as I was on my way out.
So you started as a private and ended as a commander?
I ended up as I finished as a brigadier, brigadier general, 1-star.
Does that happen a lot?
Not a lot. I mean, I joined the reserves to see what it was like, to see if I wanted a career there. So at 17, so what do you know when you're 17 years old? And then I hung around, and I guess I was last man standing, kind of thing. So that's how it nets out.
So you did. You went to officer candidate school or whatever they called it.
Yeah, it did. I went to our regular university, so kind of like ROTP. And so I served with my regiment, and in the Canadian Army, back to your point around dealing with Brits, our army's modeled on the British Army model. So a lot of our regiments are aligned with the British Army and those sort of things, and so we've got long-standing relationships and friendships with the British Army from that standpoint.
Yeah, and it's like our Navy is modeled off of the same thing, and that's why we have like major separation and of between officers and enlisted. Because I was in the Navy, because that's how the British were, and that's the big thing there. Where a lot of other, like the Army, when they're there's one mess hall when they're deployed, versus with us we have officer, NCO, and then junior enlisted.
Right. Yeah. See. Yeah. Yeah. The wardroom. Thou shalt not enter. Right. Sort of thing.
Exactly. But and I understand separation so that people understand differently. But there's some things to say that when people are trying to rally around people, it'd be nice to be connected.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. And not so much the relationship. I think one of the things that we learned from the U.S., particularly during the Afghan War, was the nature of the command team. So a sergeant major with with the leader kind of thing, and that was a command team. And we didn't necessarily have that before. You had it at the battalion level, where the regimental sergeant major and the CO were like this, but it didn't happen further down in the ranks. So that was a good sort of combining of the two, and really developed the relationships. So we learn as we go along.
Right. Well, at least we change when we need to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're still in Canada. We talked about
still in Canada. Yeah, and I've been out now for 10 years. So don't ask me anything about what's.
I'm not going to ask you anything.
I just hear all sorts of noise.
Yeah. Well, I've been out for a lot longer than that. So
there you go.
I stay connected because I just want to, get the understanding along, because there's a lot of transition stuff that we go through if we're full-time in. And then what happened when I got out was everybody's like, are you going to go in the reserves? Because I had almost finished my master's by the time I was getting out, and everybody's like, you can go and be an officer. I'm like, no, because all officers in the Navy are on line and they're on ships, and I don't want to go on a ship. I mean, that's like, I didn't join the Navy to go on a ship. I went to learn to be a corpsman, and then realized I wanted to do other things. And so, but in the reserves, I said, well, Navy stands for one thing: never again volunteer yourself. And so, even though I'm in Rotary and do other voluntary work, but that's what that's stuff for. And because my ex-wife at the time, my wife was like, well, I'm like, no, I don't want to get called up again. And they're like, oh, it'll never happen. It'll never happen. And then, they found out that the drawdown of the forces, the plan was to call up all the reservists to go to war. And there are some reservists that spent more time over there than active duty people did.
We had the same sort of thing. And we have a different model up here where you can't really call people out. A long time ago, going back to the First World War, there was an attempt to conscript people into the First World War, and almost split the country. So it's very much a volunteer force here. So
when you mean conscript, that means that you told them they had to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with us, that was called the draft. And you got drafted, and we don't have a draft now. We have selective service that says you can get called up. But the worst part of that, everybody wants, both sides to be equal, but only the men have to fill out the selective service draft.
Well, yeah. Well, no point in going into that. I mean,
I'm just saying, but you want to have unity. Let's do it across the board.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
But all right, so I did that. So back to that. So you guys never had that. So during Vietnam and everything else, you didn't sign up.
I think there was probably about 60,000 Canadians who joined the U.S. military for Vietnam, but we weren't involved in Vietnam. And all the individuals that deployed to Afghanistan, for example, being the most recent, we all had to volunteer. So it wasn't. Now, of course, there's lots of pressure, and I was at the time I was running this business that I've got, so there was lots of pressure to deploy and go and sit in the headquarters in Kandahar or Kabul or whatever. But there's no way that could work with my business. So but
that was your reserve. See, I was talking about people who, for us, up until after the Vietnam War, then the draft went away. But everybody could get drafted, whether or not you were. But reservists versus, that kind of stuff didn't even come into play at that time.
Right.
Because that was right after they had split off the Army, split off the Air Force. And so there's so many people got drafted for the Air Force because they were building that up. Because I didn't realize why so many people I knew, my dad, my uncle, everybody was in the Air Force during Vietnam. And then you come to find out, well, that was after, right, in the late 50s, they split off the Air Force. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. But I'm just surprised you didn't, we have a draft. You guys didn't have a draft. We didn't have it during Afghanistan. It was people who volunteered to go, and Iraq, all that different things after 9/11. Those were all volunteer people who signed up to go.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's always been the ethos here. That's the issue we've always had that sort of ethos that it has to be volunteer. Now, who knows? World War III, who knows what that's going to look like?
We won't even see it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It'll be over before we know it. Yeah.
Precisely.
We'll
Yeah.
be just living through it afterwards. I mean, I don't see that it's going to be. I think things are going to change going forward, just because and don't get me wrong, because I like having somebody who doesn't know what the unknown factor in a president, meaning that you don't know if he'll be dumb enough to push the button because you pissed him off. Not that he would, but you don't know that, and
Right.
if I'm going to be walking, and I do this analogy, if I'm walking down a bad neighborhood, I don't want a nice guy next to me. I want an asshole next to me. That way, I don't have to worry about anybody messing with me.
Right.
And if you think of it that way, that's basically what Trump is. Nobody likes his tweets, what he says, everything, but they like what he does. And that's not trying to get political, but that's just, if you step back and see, just like we talked beforehand, what he said about your country, about the 51st state, he throws jabs out there to knock you over, to get you off keel. That's basically what we do in a war. And we do other things. We do certain things to mess with you. I mean, how many times do we drop pamphlets and other stuff in countries and do stuff? But we need to go back to helping and this is our country first, before we give away so much money to so many other countries.
Well, just, speaking from here, there's an emotional element to this. There's not a lot of logic going
Right.
into it. So everybody's all wound up emotionally. And so they kind of cut themselves off at the neck. In other words, their minds are not engaging. It's an emotional event. And all of these changes become emotional events. But with a bit of common sense and going, really?
Yeah.
And thinking it through, that changes it. And I see that it happens in everything every day. So,
Well, I say it's going to help you guys get rid of your current person, because he's like Newsom, our governor. They're pretty boys, but don't do much.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's going. It's just the question is whether or not, whether or not we get the same government again. We'll have to see.
You guys have the same voting system, kind of like we do, right? Where everybody votes, and then it's
yeah, everybody votes, and
is it a popular vote, or is it like
no, it's by riding. So we don't
by riding means,
meaning local area by geography. So and you vote for what would be the House of Representatives for the U.S., our House of Commons. And that's the body in whichever party happens to have the largest number in the House becomes the government, and the leader of that party becomes the prime minister. So
kind of like UK, Britain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's exactly the same. Just as our head of state and the commander in chief of the Canadian forces is the king. So
wow.
So there you go.
Yeah, it's a little different than what we're used to.
Yeah, slightly, but it enables us to just focus on politics as much as possible, rather than all sorts of other things. But
important things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, you have hockey at least.
We do have that.
Yeah.
We do have that.
All right. So you were in for 34 years, retired, but during this period of time, you were building a business.
That's right. Yeah. So, which is always a challenge. And, talking about, when people retire from the military, I was just talking to someone yesterday who's retiring. He's going out on a medical, going out for medical reason. And when you retire and it's your choice is different than when you retire and it's their choice. In other words, it has an impact on people. And we see that time and time again. In my spare time, I'm part of an organization. I'm on the board of an organization called Wounded Warriors Canada. It's different from Wounded Warriors Project in the U.S. It's primarily focused on PTSD for veterans and their families. But we see this all the time when people are forced out, when the change is put upon them, it becomes that much harder. And then, of course, the issues of PTSD and how they impact families and the likes also come into play. So,
yeah, it's losing that purpose, losing what your
Exactly.
purpose is, and even for people who they're I don't know how long. So we're 4 years, depending on what it is, could be 4 years, and then or 8, depending on when most people who don't retire but get out earlier, they can do the same thing. They lose their purpose once they get out. They think they're getting out and they know what they're doing, and then things happen, and then most people I've found don't deal with their PTSD until they're in their 40s or early 50s, and they've lost every relationship they've had. Or the other thing that's happened recently that they're starting to see is once the kids are gone and it's just the husband and wife, now it's quieter and all that stuff's popping up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a microcosm of society, but it's much more stringent. It's much bigger. It's much more problematic. The military. I mean, the same thing happens to non-military families, but in the military, it's that much harder. It's that much bigger, particularly when you focused your life on service to country and service to the greater good above oneself, which is what most people do in the military.
Right, and it depends on what you. But it also depends on what you saw and what you did.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
I mean, so when I got out, I missed combat by a few days. And am I sorry for that? No, because I've talked to so many people who unfortunately were not lucky enough not to go to combat, who've had issues from it. But see, people who don't go to combat, they can still have PTSD from stuff that they've seen and whatever, and they don't realize it, or they don't think they have the right to have that that issue and get the benefits for it. And so I've been recently, I've been doing Help in the Brave for over 3 years, but recently I'm so adamant about people getting their benefits. I don't know how it is up in Canada, but we get benefits for when we get out to, whether, and it's percentage wise and everything else. And when I got out, they were like, too bad, that's not exactly what they said, but basically the VA was horrible. And then in the 2000s, still the same thing after 9/11. Then it got better in the last 8 years. And that was the first Trump administration. And then the current administration that was in, that just went away, they made it harder for you to get help. And what they did is they didn't take away what Trump did, which was go anywhere and get help, community care, that kind of stuff. They just made it harder. You had to get a referral, which took up to a year to 2 years to get.
Yeah, no, it's very true, and to your point that right from the get-go, anyone can end up having difficulties, and having a good system, a good backup system, which we didn't have for PTSD. And really, Afghanistan was the battleground where we suddenly really started to understand what this thing was, even though we'd seen it in peacekeeping missions and things before that. So, but we have there are horrendous stories here of not that long ago, probably about a year to 2 years ago, of Veterans Affairs employees suggesting people with PTSD that perhaps they should look at medically assisted suicide, which is just not on, to put it mildly.
Yeah. So our problem is they cancel appointments, cancel this. It takes, because I'm going through this, and it's not undercover. I'm going through it for my own issues, but I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Now I know why people commit suicide in the parking lots of VAs, because they can't get in to get seen, to get help with their PTSD, exactly. Because you're canceling appointments on them and they have to wait 4 months to get help. Well, in 4 months time, depending on what they're dealing with, they could take a life, and they're like, well, if they say suicide, they're not going to tell you they have suicidal tendencies. No. Yeah. Because that's not something vets will talk about.
No, exactly.
Yeah, they're not going to tell you that because they feel bad enough even asking in the first place to be there.
Yeah, I mean, everyone believes that someone is actually worse off than them, and that they should get the care rather than themselves, right? And that we see that all the time and time again.
So I didn't. So do you mind? So you said your Wounded Warrior project, or it's Wounded Warrior Canada. Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
Okay. Not the project part, but just Canada. I'm just trying to make sure I say it right. That is focused mainly on PTSD.
It is focused solely on PTSD. I mean, with universal medical care in the country, we're pretty good on physical care, although there are a lot of cases where that's kind of fallen apart. But by and large, we can ensure that there's physical care. But there wasn't anything for PTSD, and And it's gone now further for us in Canada because now all uniform services, so police, fire, ambulance, corrections, all of those businesses where they're facing stuff day in, day out as well, are really suffering. So we've had to expand into that realm, and their families again, right? Because you can't just deal with the one individual. You've got to be able to deal with caring for the kids and caring for the spouses and all of those pieces. So
Yeah, I've seen that more because I relate more, so we did this thing called Operation Firewalk where it was a 2-day event last year where we had people come in and talk. We had the guy that was the last person off the plane on the Hudson, the one that went in the Hudson, he helped everybody off. He came and talked about it and how it changed him, everything. And end of the night was an actual firewalk, kind of like a Tony Robbins event. And the guy that helped me put it on that firewalk, the walking, actually worked for Tony Robbins for 20 years as his fire captain. So I wanted to make sure nobody burned their feet. We had the right person in place. And it changed a lot of vets' lives, which I didn't realize, for them to go get their help that they needed to, because they overcame the fear by walking on coals is not a big deal but it's your limiting beliefs that you get through and the other stuff like that. Because I say, the guy who helps me, he's like, I just got to get them to take the first step. They'll keep going.
Right.
Because they're not going to stop on the goals, right? They're just going to go through it. And what I'm getting is, we did it for first responders and veterans. But at the time I was like, I'm only here for vets. This is what I'm trying to do because it's through my Rotary. Well, since then, I was a first responder in the Navy I was a corpsman and I pulled duty as EMT and that kind of major stuff afterwards. And we dealt with accidents on I-5 down in San Diego and a bunch of other stuff. And when I didn't do that, I worked in the burn care area, and I dealt with some major stuff. And I didn't realize how it would affect me until later on. And because I thought I just had a great photographic memory, which I kind of do, but this other stuff that you see and the other stuff that's there, they're like, no, yeah, that's PTSD. And so what I'm trying to get at is, people don't realize that what they're dealing with is PTSD.
Right.
And they need help to understand that. And if you have the system who's telling them that there's nothing wrong with them and you just need to move on, that's a problem.
Yeah. And in fact, in the early days of PTSD as an issue, that's exactly how it was treated. It was treated as, just move on. And then as they suddenly tried to push it, then people saying, well, what's wrong with me if I'm not getting it? And that just, so it just spun. But those are all pre-COVID days and all that sort of
stuff. The reason I brought that up because I totally agree. All those first responders. So now our Operation Firewalk this year, May 3rd, 2025, it's veterans and first responders, because I see what they're dealing with and they need as much help as our veterans do.
Yeah. And we've done a much better job of caring for our veterans in PTSD as a nation, but our first responders are really struggling, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface of that. So
yeah, and people, because when I got out, PTSD was a bad word. You couldn't even say you had that issue. Yeah. You were, I was like, it's just like a scarlet letter.
Yeah, exactly. No, precisely.
You couldn't get a job. You couldn't, if you said you had it, you were like, oh, you can't do that. Now it's different. You can get treatment for it. You can actually, there's so many things that you can do. And I know with the VA here, if they find out you're doing marijuana or something else, they almost like say, I can't help you.
Wow.
Yeah. And I've heard so many stories. I'm not saying to do this, but I heard about ayahuasca and all these different things that are totally different outside of normal stuff that has helped a lot of people. And I'm to the point where I don't care how you get your help as long as you get your help. Right. And whatever works for you. Try if this doesn't work, try something else. If that doesn't work, try something else. Because PTSD doesn't go away. You just learn how to deal with it on a daily basis.
Yeah, we one of the members of our team is a former fire chief of the largest city in Canada, and he has a great line, that you go to the doctor to get checked out physically, but you don't go to the doctor to get checked out mentally. And so the thing is that you need to go for the checkup from the neck up. And he encouraged everyone in his fire department that go and seek help, because it's just as important as the physical. And if we start thinking about that and removing the stigma and the hero complex that we have, that stoic, I can survive anything kind of thing, and realize that it's equally as important, and then perhaps we'll be able to deal with it.
I was wondering who stole the Zig Ziglar line. Check up for the neck up.
Okay, well, there you go. Was that him? I didn't realize that. Okay, what the hell happened there? Okay, this is still recording.
Julian, you still there? Sorry about that.
Yeah, no,
I have 1 gigabyte by 1 gigabyte. The whole internet for the whole street just dropped.
oh, geez.
I'll try to go back and edit out the other part, but we were talking about Zig Ziglar.
That's right.
Yeah, but I was like, that is StreamYard went bye, and I'm like, okay, what happened there? I haven't had that happen ever.
Well, hopefully I gave you enough deadpan face to be able to edit.
You will. I just got to go in there and get somebody to do it. I got time because you're a few weeks out. And again, thank you for coming on the show today. Was there anything else we didn't really get into your business? You do what kind of business do you do?
So what we do is we do work around managerial leadership development. So that's leadership training, executive coaching, and as well as consulting. So we help organizations to define their strategy. How do they structure themselves, and then how do you get the leaders behind the strategy? So that's the essence of the business. It's a small boutique business, but we work in all sorts of different industries and sectors, because it all comes down to the people, right? People are the key.
Now, you wrote a book.
I wrote a book, The Managerial Leadership Journey, which it's in Canada, we don't talk about our military backgrounds at all. It was something I never talked about before. Somebody suddenly said, you better start talking about it. So it's a bit of a combination of the civilian world meets the military world, my reflections on the military, because so much of what drives business and the belief systems in business actually come from the military. But people don't realize that. So it was a big step there. And it's designed specifically for managers of managers. Right. So individuals because you actually have to lead someone differently when you're leading leaders, as opposed to, I've got a small section of soldiers or whatever, a squad of soldiers. That's a different game entirely. So there wasn't a lot in that space. So I felt there was space for it to come into play.
Well, because I know. Do you deal with a lot of veterans? Because we find about 50% of veterans are business owners in the state. Yeah, and it's because we learn attention to detail. We learn all the stuff that you learn, and your work ethic, all that kind of stuff from the military works really well in business. The only thing that doesn't is being direct.
Right. Yeah, there is a bit of that, but it's interesting, in business. Certainly up here, to a certain extent in the U.S., I think as well, is that everybody felt that they needed to hire veterans. And so they became big corporate things. We're going to hire veterans. And so the CEO would get out there and say, we're going to hire veterans. And, he'd pass that to his head of HR. We're going to hire veterans. But nobody ever prepares the organization to taking veterans in. And there are a lot of people with attitudes, particularly up here, as to what the military are all about, and so there's a lot of preconceived notions, taken from Hollywood movies or whatever, of what members of the military are all about, and that can be quite damaging. So it's really about people really embracing the idea of having people, veterans, working with them.
Yeah, because ever since 9/11, you see a big push. Everybody likes veterans again.
Right.
And because I know when I was in late 80s, early 90s, I would tell people this because I totally forgot till I was talking to another sailor about when it was in San Diego, and down there you'd see signs on people's grasses that said, "Keep your sailor and your dog off our grass."
Right. Wow.
Yeah. And that's just because they want you there to spend the money and everything in the town, but they don't want you there, because of everything else. And luckily, since 9/11, people have cared more, and I'm glad we had those 4 years where it went really bad to now where people understand we're going back the other way again to help vets and help everything and make some changes. And that's not being political. That's just what I see with what's going on.
Yeah, no. I think there is certainly up here. We would have the stories of the guys deploying on peacekeeping missions or whatever, where the bus would drive all night through these communities because nobody ever wanted to see them. That flipped during the Afghan war, so that they would be out there and they'd be waving the flags and getting the buses to stop, and they'd be buying people coffee and all this sort of stuff. But I think it's also gone the other way for us as well. So the Afghan war is a distant memory. There's almost a generation's worth of people that don't understand any of that. So, but we have to be vigilant at all times, right?
Yeah. Because my son, he's in the Army right now. He's a medic. I was airborne, but he hit a tree and he decided that it's too much jumping out of airplanes anymore. So on his next deployment, he's like, I'm not going to be airborne. I'm just going to be, and they got him in cavalry. But he walks through the airport and he's like, Dad, it's like 100 people are telling me thank you for my service. I said, be happy with that, because I didn't get that. Yeah. I didn't have that when I went through. People didn't say that to us. They, I go across if I say I had a Vietnam vet, I'll walk across the store to thank him for his service, because they were one of the worst treated.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
I want to make sure they're taken very good care of. So if I can ever have them on, or if I can talk to them, I would like to have them on the podcast, just because there's so much of that knowledge that's going to go away here next. The greatest generation pretty much are gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the next one. And then the one after that would be the Korean War, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
All right, Julian, anything else you want to add today? How do people find your book?
It's available on Amazon.com. The Managerial Leadership Journey, an unconventional business pursuit. But the Managerial Leadership Journey is the name of the book. And there's a website around it as well.
And then that's the one that talks about how to deal with leaders, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Did you put a book together on how to deal with vets yet?
I have not done that.
Maybe you should do that one next.
Perhaps.
How to hire and change your culture to include veterans that could change your company.
Well, and every week I put out a LinkedIn post around whatever happens to be the topic of the day. And in fact, whether it's last week or whatever, it's just whatever is the topic of the day. And a lot of that right now in 2025 is the nature of control, and how do we regain control? Because it seems like the world is truly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So it's time for us to regain our control.
I totally agree. All right, Julian, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ed. It's been terrific.
All right, been my pleasure.